Sometimes the very thing that makes you different becomes the source of your greatest strength. In a world where perfection is expected and weakness is mocked, one woman's physical difference would become the key to saving lives and changing hearts forever. This is the story of how cruel laughter turned into respectful silence, how a prosthetic limb became a weapon of salvation, and how the person everyone underestimated became the hero nobody saw coming. What happens when the girl they called broken proves she's the strongest one of all? Sarah Martinez had learned to ignore the stares long ago. Walking through the military base with her prosthetic leg, she moved with a confidence that had taken years to build. The titanium and carbon fiber limb was a marvel of engineering, but, to most people, it was just a reminder that she was different. At 28, she had spent the last 5 years proving that being different didn't mean being less capable. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as Sarah made her way to the shooting range. Her job as a civilian marksmanship instructor brought her to various military installations, and today she was at Fort Henderson, a sprawling base in the mountains of Colorado. The crisp air filled her lungs as she carried her rifle case, her prosthetic leg moving in perfect rhythm with her natural one. Behind her, she could hear the whispered comments from a group of young recruits who had been watching her walk. They thought they were being quiet, but Sarah's hearing had become sharp over the years. She had learned to listen for the things people thought she couldn't hear. "Look at her trying to act all tough," one of them snickered. "How's she gonna teach us anything when she can't even walk properly?" Another voice joined in, louder this time. "Yeah, what's next? Are they gonna bring in a blind guy to teach us to see?" Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. She had heard worse. Much worse. The accident that had taken her leg 3 years ago had also taken her career as an active-duty soldier, but it hadn't taken her spirit. If anything, it had made her stronger. The comments continued behind her, growing bolder as the recruits thought they were out of earshot. "I bet she can't even hold a rifle steady with that fake leg. Probably falls over every time she fires. Someone should tell her this isn't the place for broken people." The word broken hit harder than the rest. It always did. Sarah had heard it countless times from doctors, from former colleagues, from strangers on the street. But, hearing it here, at a place where she was supposed to be respected for her skills, stung in a way that surprised her. She stopped walking and turned around. The group of 5 recruits froze, realizing they had been caught. They were all young, probably early 20s, with the cocky attitude that came with thinking they knew everything about the world. The one who had called her broken was a tall, thin young man with close-cropped brown hair and a smirk that suggested he had never faced real consequences for his words. "Is there something you'd like to say to my face?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made the recruit shift uncomfortably. The tall recruit, whose name tag read Johnson, looked around at his friends for support before stepping forward. His smirk widened as he decided to double down on his cruelty. "Just wondering how someone who's broken is supposed to teach us how to fight," he said, his voice dripping with false innocence. "I mean, no offense, but shouldn't instructors be, complete?" The other recruits laughed nervously, not sure if they should encourage Johnson or try to stop him. Sarah noticed how they looked anywhere but at her face, cowards hiding behind their friend's boldness. "Complete," Sarah repeated slowly, as if testing the word. Interesting choice of words. She set down her rifle case and looked directly at Johnson. "What makes you think I'm incomplete?" Johnson's confidence grew with what he perceived as an opportunity to show off in front of his peers. "Well, you're missing a leg, aren't you? How are you supposed to teach us proper stance and movement when you're walking around on some robot part?" The laughter from his friends was louder this time, more cruel. Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, but she had learned long ago how to use that anger productively. "You think my prosthetic makes me weak?" she asked. "I think it makes you different from us," Johnson replied. "And different usually means less capable. I mean, they don't let disabled people serve for a reason, right?" Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "You're right about one thing," she said. "I am different from you." She bent down and tapped her prosthetic leg, the sound of metal on metal ringing out clearly. "This leg is made of titanium and carbon fiber. It doesn't get tired, it doesn't cramp, and it doesn't shake when I'm under pressure. It's actually more stable than your leg. Johnson rolled his eyes. Yeah, right. I'd like to see you prove that. Would you? Sarah asked. Because I was just heading to the range to set up for today's training. Why don't you come along and see what this broken person can do? The challenge hung in the air between them. Johnson looked around at his friends, who were now watching with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. He had backed himself into a corner with his big mouth, and now he had to follow through or look weak in front of his peers. Fine, he said. But, when you embarrass yourself, don't blame me for pointing out the obvious. As they walked toward the shooting range, Sarah could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about proving herself to one arrogant recruit. It was about every time someone had told her she couldn't do something because of her prosthetic. It was about every pitying look, every whispered comment, every assumption that she was less capable because she looked different. The shooting range at Fort Henderson was impressive, with targets set at various distances and electronic scoring systems that could track accuracy down to fractions of an inch. Sarah had trained here before and knew the facility well. As they approached the firing line, she noticed that word had spread about the confrontation. Other recruits and even some officers had gathered to watch what was happening. Johnson was eating up the attention, his chest puffed out with false bravado. So what's the challenge going to be? He asked loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. I mean, I don't want to make this too easy for myself. Sarah opened her rifle case and pulled out her custom-built precision rifle. It was a thing of beauty, with a sleek design and modifications that she had made herself over years of training. The weapon felt familiar and comfortable in her hands, like an extension of her body. Simple, she said, checking the rifle's scope. We each take 10 shots at 100 yards. Best overall grouping wins. Johnson laughed. That's it? I was expecting something more challenging. Sarah looked at him with a slight smile. Oh, there's one more thing. We do it standing, unsupported. The smile faded from Johnson's face. Shooting standing without any support was significantly more difficult than shooting from a prone position or with a bipod. It required exceptional balance, muscle control, and breathing technique. For someone with a prosthetic leg, it should have been nearly impossible. You sure about that? Johnson asked, suddenly, less confident. Absolutely sure, Sarah replied. Unless you'd prefer to do it prone? I understand if standing is too challenging for you. The gathered crowd murmured at the subtle insult. Johnson's face reddened, and Sarah knew she had him exactly where she wanted him. His pride wouldn't let him back down now, even though she had just given him an out. Standing is fine, he said through gritted teeth. But, when I win, I want you to admit that people like you don't belong here. Sarah's expression grew serious. And, when I win, you're going to apologize not just to me, but to everyone who heard you call me broken. And, you're going to mean it. The range officer, a grizzled sergeant who had been watching the exchange with interest, stepped forward. All right, let's make this official. Both shooters will fire 10 rounds at the 100-yard target. Standard bullseye targets, electronic scoring. Best grouping wins. As Sarah prepared her rifle, she could feel the doubt creeping in from the gathered crowd. Even those who wanted to support her couldn't hide their concern. Standing shots with a prosthetic leg really did seem like an impossible challenge. But Sarah had learned something important over the years since her accident. The prosthetic wasn't a limitation if she knew how to use it properly. In fact, in some ways, it was an advantage. She had discovered that the solid, unwavering support it provided could actually make her shooting more stable than someone relying on muscle and bone alone. Johnson stepped up to his firing position first, his military-issued rifle looking standard and unremarkable compared to Sarah's custom weapon. He took his stance and began his breathing routine, trying to look confident for the crowd. His first shot rang out, followed by 9 more in steady succession. When the scoring system displayed his results, there was a murmur of approval from the crowd. His 10 shots had formed a tight grouping just outside the bullseye, with a total spread of about 3 inches. It was solid shooting, especially for someone who was probably nervous despite his bravado. Johnson stepped back with a satisfied grin, clearly pleased with his performance. "Your turn, robot leg," he said, unable to resist one more insult. Sarah stepped up to the firing line and took her position. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, some hopeful, some doubtful, some just curious to see what would happen. She planted her prosthetic leg firmly and adjusted her stance until everything felt perfect. The first shot surprised everyone with how quickly she fired. There was no hesitation, no lengthy preparation. Just a smooth, confident squeeze of the trigger. The second shot came just as fast, then the third. Sarah was shooting with a rhythm and precision that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. When her 10th shot echoed across the range, there was a moment of absolute silence as everyone waited for the scoring system to calculate her results. Sarah stood calmly, her rifle still shouldered, completely relaxed despite the pressure of the moment. The electronic display lit up with her score, and a collective gasp went up from the crowd. Her 10 shots had formed a grouping so tight it looked like 3 or 4 shots instead of 10. The total spread was less than 1 inch, with most of the shots touching the bullseye. Johnson's face went pale as he stared at the display. His grouping, which had seemed impressive moments before, now looked amateur by comparison. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah lowered her rifle and turned to face him. "The thing about my prosthetic," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is that it doesn't shake. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't doubt itself. When I plant it and commit to my shot, it's like having a solid piece of the earth itself supporting me." She stepped closer to Johnson, her voice dropping to a more personal level. "But the real advantage I have over you isn't my prosthetic leg. It's that I've learned not to underestimate people based on what they look like. I've learned that strength comes in many forms, and that the person you dismiss as broken might be the strongest person in the room." The crowd was silent, absorbing what they had just witnessed. Johnson looked like he wanted to disappear, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "I believe you owe me an apology," Sarah said. Johnson looked around at the faces watching him, all of them waiting to see what he would do. For a moment, it seemed like he might try to save face with another insult or excuse. But something in Sarah's eyes, a combination of strength and compassion, seemed to reach him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I was wrong to call you broken. You're not broken at all." Sarah nodded, accepting the apology. "Thank you." "And, Johnson?" "Yes, ma'am?" "The next time you meet someone who's different from you, try to see their strength before you focus on what you think makes them weak. You might be surprised by what you learn." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah packed up her rifle, feeling satisfied but not triumphant. She had proven her point, but she knew this was just one small battle in a much larger war against prejudice and assumption. What she didn't know was that this moment would be just the beginning of a much larger test, one that would prove her worth in ways she could never have imagined. The real challenge was still coming, and, when it arrived, everything she had just demonstrated would seem small in comparison. As she walked away from the range, Sarah could feel that something had shifted. The stares she received now were different, less pitying, more respectful. Johnson's friends looked at her with a newfound wariness, as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time. But Sarah's mind was already moving ahead to the training session she was supposed to conduct later that day. She had work to do, soldiers to train, and a reputation to continue building. The incident at the range was just another step in her ongoing journey to prove that being different didn't mean being less capable. She had no idea that within hours, her unique combination of skills, determination, and that titanium leg would be put to a test that would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone at Fort Henderson. 3 hours after her confrontation with Johnson at the shooting range, Sarah stood before a group of 20 recruits in the base's main training facility. The room was buzzing with nervous energy, and she could tell that word about the earlier incident had spread throughout the base. Some of the recruits looked at her with newfound respect, while others seemed skeptical that the morning's display had been anything more than luck. Johnson sat in the back row, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sullen silence. His friends flanked him, occasionally whispering comments that Sarah chose to ignore. She had made her point earlier, and now it was time to focus on the real work of training these young soldiers. Today we're going to talk about precision shooting under stress, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Most of you can probably hit a target when you're calm, rested, and have all the time in the world. But combat isn't calm or restful, and you definitely don't have all the time in the world. She moved to the front of the room where a large screen displayed various combat scenarios. The difference between an average marksman and an exceptional one isn't just accuracy. It's the ability to maintain that accuracy when everything is falling apart around you. A recruit near the front raised her hand. Sarah recognized her as Private Martinez, no relation despite the shared last name. She was one of the more serious students, always asking thoughtful questions. "Instructor Martinez, how do you simulate that kind of stress in training?" Sarah smiled. "Good question, Martinez. Anyone have ideas?" Several hands went up. Sarah pointed to a young man in the middle section. "Physical exhaustion," he suggested. "Make them run before shooting?" "That's one method," Sarah agreed. "Physical stress can definitely affect your shooting." "What else?" "Time pressure," offered another recruit. "Absolutely. Time limits can create the kind of mental pressure you'll face in real situations." "What about environmental factors?" The discussion continued for several minutes, with recruits offering increasingly creative suggestions. Sarah was impressed by their engagement, and she noticed that even Johnson seemed to be paying attention despite his earlier hostility. "All good ideas," Sarah said finally. "Today we're going to combine several of these approaches. You're going to experience what it's like to make accurate shots when your heart is pounding, your hands are shaking, and you have multiple distractions competing for your attention." She gestured toward the door. "We're heading to the advanced training course. You'll notice it's not your typical shooting range." The group filed out of the classroom and followed Sarah across the base to a facility that looked more like an obstacle course than a traditional range. There were barriers to climb, trenches to navigate, and targets positioned at varying distances and heights. Sound systems were set up to play recordings of gunfire and explosions. "This is where we separate the recreational shooters from the combat marksmen," Sarah explained. "The course is designed to stress every aspect of your shooting fundamentals. You'll be physically exhausted, mentally overwhelmed, and operating under strict time constraints." She pointed to different sections of the course. "You'll start at the beginning and work your way through each station. Some require precision at distance, others test your ability to quickly engage multiple targets." The course record is held by Lieutenant Colonel Hayes with a time of 4 minutes and 37 seconds and a 93% hit rate. A recruit named Williams raised his hand. "What's your best time, instructor?" Sarah paused, considering whether to share that information. She had actually beaten the course record on several occasions, but she didn't want to seem like she was showing off after the morning's incident. "Let's just say I'm familiar with the course," she replied diplomatically. "Who wants to go first?" Several volunteers stepped forward, eager to test themselves. Sarah watched as the first few recruits made their way through the course, taking notes on their techniques and areas for improvement. The course was clearly challenging them in ways they hadn't expected. The sound of helicopters approaching drew Sarah's attention away from the training. She looked up to see 2 military aircraft circling the base before heading toward the landing pad near the administration building. It wasn't unusual for helicopters to arrive at Fort Henderson, but something about their flight pattern seemed urgent. "Keep running the course," Sarah called to the recruits. "I'll be right back." She jogged toward the administration building, her prosthetic leg moving smoothly across the uneven terrain. As she got closer, she could see uniformed personnel rushing around the landing pad with an urgency that suggested this wasn't a routine visit. The first helicopter had already landed, and Sarah could see several high-ranking officers disembarking. The second helicopter was still circling, as if waiting for clearance or scanning the area for threats. Sarah's military training kicked in, and she felt the familiar heightening of awareness that came with potential danger. Her radio crackled to life. "All personnel, this is command. We have VIP movement on base. All training exercises are to continue normally unless specifically directed otherwise. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and started to head back to her recruits when she noticed something that made her stop. One of the officers from the helicopter was scanning the surrounding area with binoculars, not in the casual way of someone observing a new location, but with the focused intensity of someone looking for threats. Her instincts told her something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on what. The helicopter crew seemed more alert than usual, and there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there moments before. She keyed her radio. "Command, this is Instructor Martinez at the training course. Everything appears normal here. Do you need us to modify our training schedule?" "Negative, Martinez. Continue your exercise. Command out." Sarah frowned at the abrupt response. In her experience, when command was that brief, it usually meant they were dealing with something they didn't want to discuss over the radio. She headed back to the training course, but kept her radio volume up and continued to monitor the helicopter activity. The second aircraft had finally landed, and she could see even more personnel moving around with purpose. Back at the training course, her recruits were making steady progress through the obstacle course. Johnson was currently halfway through, and Sarah had to admit he was performing better than she had expected. His shooting was solid, and he was moving through the physical challenges with good speed and efficiency. "Not bad, Johnson," she called as he engaged a series of pop-up targets. "Keep your breathing steady through the movement." He acknowledged her advice with a nod and continued through the course. Whatever attitude adjustment he had experienced after the morning's shooting demonstration seemed to be holding. Sarah was watching Private Martinez navigate a particularly challenging section when her radio erupted with urgent chatter. "Security alert, security alert. All units respond to Code Black. I repeat, Code Black at the administration building." Sarah's blood ran cold. Code Black meant an active threat to high-value personnel. Someone was trying to harm the VIPs who had just arrived. "All training exercises cease immediately," came the next transmission. "All personnel take shelter and await further instructions." Sarah looked at her group of recruits, who had stopped their training and were looking to her for guidance. They could all hear the radio chatter, and the more experienced ones understood what Code Black meant. "Everyone form up," Sarah ordered, her training instructor voice shifting to combat mode. "We're moving to the nearest hardened structure immediately." The recruits quickly gathered their gear and formed a defensive formation around Sarah. She could see the questions in their eyes, but they were following her lead without hesitation. As they moved toward the training facility's main building, Sarah's radio continued to provide updates that painted an increasingly dire picture. "Multiple hostiles confirmed at the administration building. VIP personnel are trapped on the second floor. All available security teams respond immediately. Sniper activity reported from the eastern ridge. Long-range support needed immediately. Unknown number of hostiles. They appear to be well-equipped and organized." Sarah's mind was racing as she processed the information. The eastern ridge overlooked most of the base, including the administration building where the VIPs were trapped. If the attackers had positioned snipers there, it would be extremely difficult for security teams to approach the building safely. She thought about the range estimation from the ridge to the administration building. It had to be at least 600 yards, possibly more. That was a challenging shot even under ideal conditions, and combat conditions were never ideal. "Instructor Martinez," Private Martinez whispered urgently. "Shouldn't we be getting further away from this?" Sarah was about to agree when another transmission stopped her cold. "All sniper teams are engaged elsewhere on base. We have no long-range assets available to neutralize the ridge position. Security teams cannot advance until the sniper threat is eliminated." Sarah looked toward the eastern ridge, barely visible in the distance. She thought about her custom rifle back at the original shooting range, about the demonstration she had given just hours earlier, about the skills she had been developing and refining since her accident. She thought about the people trapped in that building, counting on someone to help them. She thought about Johnson's words from the morning, "They don't let disabled people serve for a reason." Maybe not in active duty, she thought, but sometimes service takes forms you don't expect. Sarah keyed her radio with a decision that would change everything. Command, this is Instructor Martinez. I have a possible solution to the sniper problem. Go ahead, Martinez. I'm a qualified long-range marksman with appropriate equipment. I can provide overwatch support from the main shooting range. It has a clear line of sight to the eastern ridge. There was a pause before Command responded. Martinez, you're a civilian contractor. This is beyond your scope of responsibility. With respect, Command, people are in danger and you don't have other options. I'm volunteering. Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could imagine the frantic discussion taking place in the command center. Martinez, what's your longest confirmed shot? Sarah took a breath. 850 yards, wind at 15 knots, moving target. Jesus, she heard someone mutter over the radio before the transmission cut. When Command came back on, their tone was different. Martinez, you are authorized to provide sniper support. All available personnel will provide security for your position. Sarah turned to her recruits, who were staring at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Johnson, she said. Remember what you said about disabled people not serving? Johnson nodded, his face pale. You're about to find out how wrong you were. Sarah's decision to volunteer for sniper support sent shockwaves through her group of recruits. She could see the disbelief in their faces, the sudden understanding that their civilian instructor was about to enter active combat. Johnson looked particularly stunned, his earlier mockery of her capabilities now seeming incredibly naive. All of you stay here and take shelter in the training building, Sarah ordered, her voice taking on the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in combat before her accident. Follow the base security protocols and wait for the all-clear. Instructor Martinez, Private Martinez called out, her voice tight with concern. Are you sure about this? Sarah was already moving toward the main shooting range where she had left her rifle case after the morning's demonstration. I'm sure, she called back without slowing down. And, Martinez? Take notes. This is what real marksmanship looks like. As she ran across the base, Sarah's mind shifted into combat mode. She had been in firefights before her accident, had made life-and-death shots under pressure, had felt the weight of other people's lives depending on her accuracy. The familiar mental preparation came flooding back as if no time had passed at all. Her radio crackled constantly with updates from the unfolding situation. The attackers had successfully trapped the VIP delegation on the second floor of the administration building, and the sniper on the eastern ridge was preventing any rescue attempts. Every few minutes, the ridge sniper would fire a shot to remind security forces that approaching the building was impossible. Unknown sniper is extremely well positioned, came a report from one of the security teams. Professional-grade equipment, excellent field of view, multiple escape routes. This isn't some random attack. Sarah reached the shooting range and quickly retrieved her rifle case. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she assembled and checked her weapon, the same custom-built precision rifle that had impressed everyone just hours earlier. She loaded a fresh magazine of match-grade ammunition and clipped extra magazines to her belt. A security team arrived just as she finished her preparations. The team leader, a sergeant named Davis, looked skeptical as he approached. Ma'am, I have to ask, Davis said carefully, when was the last time you made a combat shot? Sarah looked up from checking her scope adjustments. 3 years ago, Afghanistan. But, Sergeant, shooting is like riding a bike. The fundamentals don't change. 3 years is a long time, ma'am. So is 850 yards, Sarah replied. Which was my last confirmed kill shot before the IED that took my leg. Davis's expression changed as he realized he was talking to someone with real combat experience. What do you need from us, ma'am? Security for this position and real-time intelligence on the ridge sniper, Sarah said as she moved to the shooting platform that offered the best angle toward the eastern ridge. I need to know exactly where he is and what kind of movement patterns he's using. She set up her rifle on the concrete shooting bench, adjusting her position until everything felt perfect. The prosthetic leg planted firmly against the ground, providing the solid foundation she had described to Johnson earlier. Through her scope, she could see the eastern ridge clearly, scanning for any sign of the enemy sniper. "Command, this is Martinez in position at the main range. I have visual on the eastern ridge. What's the current situation?" "Martinez, we have confirmation of at least one sniper with a high-powered rifle. He's been taking shots every few minutes to keep our people pinned down. The VIPs are safe for now, but we can't move them until that ridge is clear." Sarah continued scanning through her scope, looking for the telltale signs that would reveal the sniper's position. A glint of metal, a muzzle flash, disturbed vegetation, anything that would give her a target. "Movement on the ridge," called one of the security team members who was using binoculars to assist in the search. 2 o'clock from the large boulder formation. Sarah swung her rifle toward the indicated area and immediately spotted what the observer had seen. It was subtle, just a slight disturbance in the natural pattern of the landscape, but her trained eye picked it out immediately. "I see him," she reported. "Approximately 700 yards, well-concealed position behind natural cover. He's got good fields of fire and multiple fallback positions." "Can you take the shot?" Command asked. Sarah studied the target through her scope, calculating distance, wind speed, and elevation changes. The target was partially hidden behind rocks and vegetation, presenting only a small window of opportunity. It was exactly the kind of challenging shot that separated good snipers from exceptional ones. "Negative on the shot," Sarah reported. "Target is too well concealed. I need him to expose himself." "How do we make that happen?" Sarah thought for a moment, considering the tactical situation. The enemy sniper was comfortable in his position because he had been shooting at security forces who couldn't effectively return fire. If he suddenly came under accurate long-range fire himself, he might make the mistake of trying to locate and engage the new threat. "I'm going to take a shot at his position," Sarah said. "Even if I don't hit him, it should force him to move and look for the source of incoming fire. That's when I'll have him." "Roger that. All security teams, prepare to advance on the administration building as soon as the ridge threat is neutralized." Sarah settled into her shooting position, feeling the familiar calm that came over her when everything else faded away except for the target. Her breathing slowed and deepened. Her heart rate dropped. The world narrowed down to just her rifle, the target, and the space between them. She aimed at the spot where she had seen movement and slowly squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she immediately chambered another round while watching through the scope for the target's reaction. The shot struck the rocks just inches from where the sniper was hidden, sending stone fragments flying. As Sarah had predicted, the sudden incoming fire caused the enemy sniper to react instinctively. He shifted position to try to locate the source of the shot, exposing himself for just a moment. But a moment was all Sarah needed. The second shot came so quickly after the first that observers thought they had heard an echo. Through her scope, Sarah watched as the enemy sniper jerked and went still. The ridge threat had been eliminated. "Target down," Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Ridge is clear for security team advance." "Outstanding shooting, Martinez," came the response from command. "Security teams are moving now." Sarah remained in position, continuing to scan the ridge for any additional threats while security teams rushed toward the administration building. She could see through her scope as they reached the building and began their assault to rescue the VIPs. But her job wasn't finished yet. "Martinez, we have a problem," command reported. "Initial sweep of the building shows more hostiles than expected. The rescue team is pinned down on the first floor. They need immediate fire support." Sarah swung her rifle toward the administration building, scanning the windows for targets. The distance was shorter than the ridge shot, only about 400 yards, but the tactical situation was more complex. She needed to provide precise fire support without endangering the rescue team or the VIPs they were trying to save. "Command, I need exact positions of our people before I can engage," Sarah said. "I'm not taking any shots until I know exactly where friendlies are located." "Roger that." Security team, report your positions. For the next several minutes, Sarah coordinated with the security team leader inside the building, establishing clear fields of fire and identifying enemy positions. It was delicate work, requiring constant communication and precise shooting. When the first target presented itself in a second-floor window, Sarah was ready. The shot took out a hostile who had been firing down at the security team, immediately changing the dynamic of the firefight inside the building. "Great shot, Martinez," came the radio call from inside the building. That opened up our advance route. Sarah continued providing overwatch support, taking carefully aimed shots whenever enemy fighters exposed themselves. Each shot had to be perfect, as the margin for error was non-existent when friendly forces were in such close proximity. The firefight inside the building continued for what felt like hours but was actually only about 20 minutes. Sarah fired 8 more rounds, each one eliminating a threat and helping the security team advance toward the VIPs. Finally, the radio crackled with the news everyone had been waiting for. "Command, this is Security Team Alpha. Building is secure. All VIPs are safe and accounted for. I repeat, all VIPs are safe." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding and saved her rifle. The immediate crisis was over, but she knew the investigation and cleanup would continue for hours. "Martinez, this is Command. Outstanding performance. Report to the command center for debrief when you're ready." As Sarah began packing up her rifle, she became aware of the crowd that had gathered behind her during the firefight. Her recruits had apparently ignored her orders to take shelter and had instead come to watch their instructor in action. They stood in respectful silence, staring at her with a mixture of awe and newfound understanding. Johnson stepped forward from the group, his face pale but his expression serious. "Instructor Martinez," he said formally, "I owe you a lot more than an apology." Sarah looked at him and saw something different in his eyes. The arrogance and mockery were gone, replaced by genuine respect and perhaps a little shame at his earlier behavior. "What you did today," Johnson continued, "that was the most incredible shooting I've ever seen. And you did it all while dealing with..." He gestured awkwardly toward her prosthetic leg, while dealing with challenges that would have stopped most people. "The leg didn't stop me, Johnson," Sarah replied quietly. "In some ways, it helped me. But the real lesson here isn't about my prosthetic." She stood up and faced the entire group of recruits who had gathered. "The lesson is that you never know what someone is capable of until you give them a chance to show you. Today you saw what happens when someone who looks different gets the opportunity to prove their worth." She gestured toward the administration building where security personnel were still securing the scene. "Those VIPs are alive because someone who gets called broken and robot leg happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills. Think about that the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on how they look or what makes them different." The recruits nodded solemnly, clearly understanding that they had witnessed something significant. This wasn't just about marksmanship or combat skills. It was about courage, capability, and the danger of underestimating people based on superficial judgments. But Sarah's role in this crisis wasn't over yet. As she finished packing her equipment, her radio crackled with an urgent transmission that would change everything once again. "All personnel, this is Command. We have confirmation that this was a coordinated attack with multiple phases. The administration building assault was just the first part. Intelligence indicates a secondary attack planned for the main base perimeter within the next hour." Sarah looked at her rifle case, then at the group of recruits watching her expectantly. The crisis she thought was ending was actually just beginning. The news of a secondary attack sent immediate shockwaves through Fort Henderson. Sarah could see the change in her recruits' faces as the reality sank in that their base was under coordinated assault. What had started as a training day had turned into their first real combat experience, and they were looking to her for leadership despite her civilian status. "Command, this is Martinez," Sarah radioed. "What's the nature of the secondary threat?" "Intelligence indicates a larger assault force approaching from the south perimeter," came the urgent reply. "Estimated 15 to 20 hostiles with heavy weapons. ETA approximately 45 minutes. Sarah's military mind immediately began calculating defensive positions and fields of fire. The south perimeter was the most vulnerable part of the base, with several access points that would be difficult to defend with the limited security forces currently available. Command, what's our current defensive capability? Most of our security teams are still tied up securing the administration building and processing the scene. We have maybe 8 personnel available for perimeter defense. 8 people against 20 attackers with heavy weapons was not good odds. Sarah looked at her group of 20 recruits, all of them listening intently to the radio traffic. They were young and inexperienced, but they had been training for combat situations. Sometimes circumstances forced you to use what you had instead of what you wanted. Johnson, Sarah called out. You and your team, what's your current qualification status? Johnson straightened up, understanding that this was no longer about training or morning confrontations. All 20 of us are qualified on basic weapons, ma'am. Most of us have completed advanced marksmanship training. Combat experience? None, ma'am. This is our first assignment. Sarah nodded, making rapid calculations. Inexperienced soldiers with good training were still better than no soldiers at all, and she had just demonstrated that unconventional thinking could overcome significant challenges. She keyed her radio. Command, this is Martinez. I have 20 qualified personnel with me who could augment perimeter defense. Request permission to organize a defensive position. There was a long pause before command responded. Martinez, those are recruits with no combat experience. And, you're a civilian instructor. Roger that, command. But, I'm also the person who just neutralized the Ridge sniper and provided fire support for the VIP rescue. These recruits may be inexperienced, but they're trained and motivated. Sometimes you work with what you have. Another pause, then, Martinez, you're authorized to organize defensive positions on the south perimeter. All available security personnel will support your position. Sarah turned to face her recruits, seeing a mixture of nervousness and determination in their faces. They understood the gravity of the situation, but they were ready to follow her lead. Listen up, she said in her command voice. This is no longer a training exercise. We have real hostiles approaching our position with intent to cause harm. Some of you are probably scared, and that's normal. But we're going to use that fear to keep us sharp and focused. She pointed toward the south perimeter. We're going to establish overlapping fields of fire covering all the main approach routes. Everyone will have a specific sector of responsibility, and we're going to coordinate our fire to maximum effect. Private Martinez raised her hand. Instructor, what about ammunition? We only have what we were issued for training. Sarah had already considered that problem. Command, we're going to need additional ammunition and any available heavy weapons for the perimeter defense. Roger, Martinez. Supply team is loading ammunition and equipment now. You'll have 2 M240 machine guns and sufficient rounds for sustained engagement. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of activity as Sarah organized her improvised defense force. She positioned the 2 machine guns to cover the most likely approach routes, with teams of riflemen filling in the gaps between positions. Each recruit was assigned a specific field of fire, and she made sure they understood the importance of fire discipline and target identification. Johnson proved surprisingly capable as a team leader, organizing his squad and ensuring everyone understood their assignments. The arrogance and mockery from the morning had been completely replaced by focused professionalism. Remember, Sarah emphasized as they finished their preparations, these aren't targets on a range. They're real people who want to hurt you and everyone on this base. You shoot to stop the threat, and you keep shooting until the threat is stopped. Her radio crackled with an update from command. Martinez, perimeter sensors indicate contact in 15 minutes. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south. Sarah moved to her chosen firing position, a reinforced concrete barrier that offered good cover and excellent visibility across the approach routes. Her custom rifle was loaded and ready, and she had additional magazines positioned for quick reloading. All positions, this is Martinez. Weapons tight until I give the command to engage. Let them get close enough that we can't miss. The waiting was always the hardest part. Sarah could see the nervous energy in her recruits as they peered over their defensive positions, watching for the first sign of enemy contact. She used the time to make final adjustments to her scope and review the terrain one more time. Movement to the south, called out one of the observers. Multiple vehicles, looks like pickup trucks with mounted weapons. Sarah raised her rifle and scanned through the scope until she spotted the approaching convoy. 5 pickup trucks, each carrying several armed men, approaching fast down the main access road. She could see heavy machine guns mounted in the truck beds and additional weapons being carried by the passengers. Count is approximately 25 hostiles, Sarah reported to command. 5 vehicles with mounted weapons. They're coming in fast and aggressive. Roger, Martinez. You are cleared to engage when ready. Sarah continued tracking the lead vehicle through her scope, waiting for the optimal moment to begin the engagement. The convoy was spreading out as they approached, trying to make themselves a more difficult target. It was a smart tactical move that suggested these weren't amateur fighters. All positions, stand by, Sarah called over the radio. Engage on my command. The lead vehicle was now within 400 yards, close enough that the recruits could engage effectively with their rifles. Sarah centered her crosshairs on the driver of the lead truck and took a deep breath. Engage, engage, engage. Sarah's rifle cracked first, and the lead vehicle immediately swerved as her shot took out the driver. The truck rolled and crashed, spilling armed men onto the ground. Almost immediately, the defensive line erupted with rifle fire as her recruits opened up on the remaining vehicles. The 2 machine guns roared to life, their sustained fire raking the approaching convoy. Sarah watched through her scope as her careful positioning paid off. The overlapping fields of fire created a devastating crossfire that the attackers couldn't avoid. But the enemy wasn't going down easily. The surviving vehicles scattered and began returning fire with their mounted weapons, forcing Sarah's people to take cover. Heavy machine gun rounds chewed up the concrete barriers and sent fragments flying. Stay down but keep shooting, Sarah yelled over the noise of the firefight. Short bursts aimed fire. She continued engaging targets with her rifle, taking carefully aimed shots at exposed enemy fighters. Each shot counted, as her precision rifle could reach out and touch targets that were beyond the effective range of the recruits' standard weapons. Martinez, this is Johnson, came a call over the radio. We've got vehicles trying to flank around the east side. Sarah swung her rifle toward the eastern approach and immediately spotted 2 pickup trucks trying to circle around their defensive position. If they succeeded, they would be able to attack the perimeter from behind. I see them, Sarah replied. Keep your sector covered, I'll deal with the flanking attempt. She tracked the lead flanking vehicle and sent a shot through the windshield, causing it to crash into a concrete barrier. The second vehicle stopped and dismounted its passengers, who began advancing on foot toward the eastern flank. Command, we need support on the eastern flank, Sarah radioed. Multiple hostiles advancing on foot. Negative, Martinez. No additional support available. You'll have to handle it with current resources. Sarah looked at her defensive line, calculating rapidly. If she pulled people from the main firing line to cover the flank, it would weaken their defense against the primary attack. But, if she let the flanking attack succeed, they would be overrun from behind. Martinez, Williams, Rodriguez, she called out to 3 of the nearest recruits. You're with me. We're going to stop that flank attack. The 4 of them moved quickly toward the eastern side of the perimeter, Sarah leading with her rifle ready. They reached a position that overlooked the advancing enemy fighters just as the hostiles were preparing to assault the main defensive line from behind. Take them, Sarah ordered, and all 4 weapons opened fire simultaneously. The surprise attack devastated the flanking force, dropping several enemy fighters immediately and sending the rest scrambling for cover. Sarah continued to engage targets with precision shots while the 3 recruits provided suppressing fire. Flank attack neutralized, Sarah reported. Returning to main positions. As they moved back toward the primary defensive line, Sarah could see that the main battle was still raging. Her recruits were performing better than she had expected, maintaining disciplined fire and holding their positions despite the intense enemy pressure. But she could also see that ammunition was running low, and they had taken some casualties. 2 recruits were wounded but still fighting, and the machine gun positions were running through their ammunition at an alarming rate. "Command, this is Martinez. We need immediate resupply and medical support." "Martinez, supply convoy is en route but still 10 minutes out. Medical team is standing by but can't advance until the engagement is concluded." 10 minutes was a long time in a firefight. Sarah looked at her remaining ammunition and calculated that they had maybe 5 minutes of sustained fire left before they would be reduced to individual magazines. That's when she noticed something that changed everything. Through her scope, she could see a figure directing the enemy attack from a position behind the remaining vehicles. The man was clearly in command, coordinating the assault and directing his fighters' movements. If she could take out the leader, it might break the attack completely. The shot was over 600 yards through cover and concealment, with enemy fire coming in from multiple directions. It was exactly the kind of impossible shot that people said couldn't be made under combat conditions. Sarah steadied her rifle against a concrete barrier, planted her prosthetic leg firmly for stability, and began the breathing routine that had served her throughout her career. Through the scope, she could see the enemy leader clearly as he gestured and shouted orders to his men. She thought about Johnson's words from that morning, "They don't let disabled people serve for a reason." She thought about all the people who had told her what she couldn't do because of her prosthetic leg. She thought about the recruits depending on her to get them through this fight alive. Sarah Martinez took the shot that would end the battle and change her life forever. The silence that followed Sarah's final shot was almost more shocking than the firefight that had preceded it. Through her scope, she watched as the enemy leader collapsed, and immediately the coordinated attack began to fall apart. Without their commander directing movements and maintaining communication, the remaining attackers lost their tactical cohesion. "Target down," Sarah reported over the radio, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. Enemy leader eliminated at 630 yards. The effect on the remaining hostiles was immediate and dramatic. Seeing their leader fall and realizing they were facing a sniper capable of reaching out and touching them at extreme range, the surviving attackers began a disorganized retreat. Within minutes, the sustained enemy fire had dwindled to sporadic shots as fighters abandoned their positions and fled. "Cease fire, cease fire," Sarah ordered as she watched the last enemy vehicle disappear into the distance. "All positions report status." One by one, her recruits checked in. Despite the intensity of the engagement, casualties had been remarkably light. 2 wounded, neither seriously, and everyone else was accounted for and functional. "Command, this is Martinez. South perimeter is secure. Enemy forces have withdrawn. We have 2 wounded requiring medical attention but no critical casualties." "Outstanding work, Martinez," came the response from command. "Medical teams are en route to your position. Security teams are conducting area sweeps to ensure no hostiles remain on base." As the adrenaline of combat began to fade, Sarah became aware of the profound change that had occurred in her group of recruits. They looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, not just respect or admiration, but something approaching awe. They had watched their civilian instructor take command of a desperate situation and lead them through their first real combat engagement with skill that many career soldiers never displayed. Johnson approached her as she was securing her rifle. His face was dirty and streaked with sweat, but his eyes were bright with excitement and something that looked like gratitude. "Instructor Martinez," he said, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been there before. "I need to say something, and I need to say it in front of everyone." Sarah looked up from her equipment to find that all of the recruits had gathered around her position. They stood in a rough semicircle, their weapons lowered but ready, their faces reflecting the magnitude of what they had just experienced together. "This morning I called you broken," Johnson continued, his voice carrying clearly across the group. "I said disabled people don't belong in the military. I was wrong about everything." He gestured toward the battlefield where they had just fought. "What happened here today, what you did for all of us, that wasn't broken. that was the strongest, most capable fighting I've ever seen. You saved all our lives, and you saved the lives of those VIPs in the building." Several of the other recruits nodded in agreement. Private Martinez stepped forward to add her own thoughts. "You didn't just teach us about marksmanship today," she said. "You taught us about leadership, about courage, and about not giving up when things get impossible." Sarah felt an unexpected emotion welling up in her chest. For 3 years since her accident, she had been fighting to prove that she was still capable, still valuable, still able to contribute. Today had been the ultimate test of everything she had worked to rebuild about herself. "Thank you," she said simply. "All of you performed beyond expectations today. You held your positions, maintained fire discipline, and worked as a team when it mattered most. You should be proud of what you accomplished." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the moment. Sarah looked up to see a convoy of military vehicles approaching their position, led by several command vehicles with high-ranking officers visible in the passenger seats. "Looks like the brass is coming to see what happened," observed one of the recruits. Sarah stood and straightened her uniform, suddenly aware that she was about to face questions and scrutiny from senior military leadership. As a civilian contractor, she had technically exceeded her authority by taking command of military personnel in a combat situation. The fact that it had been necessary and successful didn't necessarily mean it would be viewed favorably by the chain of command. The lead vehicle stopped nearby, and Sarah was surprised to see a full colonel emerge, followed by several other senior officers. Behind them, she could see news crews and cameras, suggesting that word of the base attack had already reached the media. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, approached Sarah directly. His expression was unreadable, and Sarah found herself standing at attention despite her civilian status. "Ms. Martinez," Colonel Harrison said formally, "I understand you took command of military personnel and organized the defense of this perimeter?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "Emergency circumstances required immediate action, and command authorized my involvement." "I'm aware of the authorizations," the colonel said. "What I'm trying to understand is how a civilian contractor with a prosthetic leg managed to coordinate a successful defense against 25 armed attackers while simultaneously providing precision sniper support." Sarah wasn't sure if the question was critical or complimentary, so she decided to stick with facts. "Sir, I utilized available personnel and equipment to establish overlapping fields of fire covering likely approach routes. Standard defensive tactics adapted to the terrain and available resources." Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment. "Ms. Martinez, I've been in the Army for 28 years. I've seen a lot of combat and worked with a lot of talented soldiers. What you accomplished today, with inexperienced personnel and improvised resources, was exceptional by any standard." He paused and looked around at the recruits who were still gathered nearby, listening to every word. "More than that," the colonel continued, "you turned a group of trainees into an effective fighting force in a matter of minutes. That level of leadership and tactical competence is rare at any level." Sarah began to relax slightly as she realized the tone of the conversation was shifting toward recognition rather than criticism. "Sir, these recruits performed beyond expectations. They followed orders, maintained discipline under fire, and adapted to changing tactical situations. The credit belongs to them." "The credit," Colonel Harrison said with a slight smile, "belongs to the leader who prepared them and guided them through the engagement. Which brings me to why I'm here." He gestured toward one of his staff officers, who stepped forward with an official-looking document folder. "Ms. Martinez, I've been authorized by Army Personnel Command to offer you a direct commission as a captain in the U.S. Army. Your performance today has demonstrated that your disability retirement was perhaps premature, and that you have capabilities we need." Sarah felt her heart stop for a moment. A direct commission would mean returning to active duty, returning to the career that had been cut short by her accident. It was something she had dreamed about but never thought possible. "Sir, I'm honored by the offer," she said carefully. "But I want to be clear about my limitations. The prosthetic leg does affect my mobility in certain situations." Colonel Harrison looked down at her prosthetic leg, then back at her face. Ms. Martinez, in the last 6 hours you've made precision shots under combat conditions, organized an effective defense, led inexperienced soldiers through their first firefight, and eliminated threats at ranges that most of our snipers couldn't match. If that's what you can do with limitations, I'd hate to see what you could accomplish without them." The group of recruits had been listening to the entire conversation, and Sarah could see the excitement and pride on their faces. Johnson looked like he might burst with the desire to speak, but he maintained military discipline and waited for permission. "What would my assignment be?" Sarah asked. "Initially, you'd be assigned to the Army Marksmanship Unit as a senior instructor and tactical advisor," the colonel explained. "We need someone with your combination of combat experience and teaching ability to develop new training programs." Sarah thought about the offer, considering everything it would mean. Returning to active duty had been her secret hope since the day she learned to walk again with the prosthetic leg. But she had never imagined it might actually be possible. "Sir, I accept the commission." The colonel smiled broadly and extended his hand. "Welcome back to the Army, Captain Martinez." As they shook hands, the gathered recruits erupted in cheers and applause. Johnson stepped forward and saluted with perfect military precision. "Captain Martinez," he said formally, "it's an honor to have served under your command." Sarah returned the salute, feeling the weight and meaning of the gesture. "The honor was mine, Johnson. All of you." As the crowd of officers, recruits, and media personnel continued to grow around their position, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey her day had taken. It had started with cruel mockery of her prosthetic leg and had ended with a direct commission back to active duty based on her performance in combat. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very thing Johnson had mocked her for, the prosthetic leg that he said made her broken, had actually been a crucial factor in her success. The solid, unwavering support it provided had enabled the precision shooting that saved lives and stopped the attack. Private Martinez approached as the formal ceremonies began to wind down. "Captain Martinez," she said with a grin, "I have to ask. This morning when Johnson was giving you a hard time about your leg, did you have any idea the day would end like this?" Sarah looked around at the scene, the successful defensive positions, the celebrating recruits, the senior officers treating her with respect and admiration, the media crews documenting the story of the disabled instructor who had saved the day. "Martinez," she said with a smile, "I've learned that you never know what someone is truly capable of until circumstances force them to show you. Today we all learned that lesson together." As the sun set over Fort Henderson, Captain Sarah Martinez stood among her recruits and fellow soldiers, no longer defined by what she had lost, but celebrated for what she had found. The prosthetic leg that had once marked her as different had become the foundation for her greatest achievements. And, somewhere in the crowd, Johnson was telling anyone who would listen about his instructor who had grabbed a rifle and saved everyone, including a general who had been among the VIPs in the administration building. He never called her broken again. In fact, he spent the rest of his military career telling people about the strongest person he had ever met, a woman who proved that being different wasn't a weakness, but could be the source of incredible strength. The story of Captain Sarah Martinez became a legend at Fort Henderson and beyond, inspiring countless others who had been told they were limited by their differences to push beyond those perceived limitations and show the world what they were truly capable of achieving. Her prosthetic leg, once a source of shame and mockery, became a symbol of triumph and possibility. And every recruit who trained under her learned the most important lesson of all: never underestimate someone based on what makes them different, because that difference might be exactly what makes them extraordinary.